Hi everyone. I had a chance today to sit down and watch something on Netflix that I've been putting off for quite a while. It was These Final Hours by Zak Hilditch, starring Nathan Phillips and Jessica DeGruy. As far as I understand it, it's an Aussie film, an Australian independent drama about the Earth being struck by a meteor and causing essentially a blanket of fire to slowly envelop the entire planet. The way that they explain it, though, I always thought it was a tidal wave, but in all actuality, it is a blanket of fire. At one point in the film, a character describes it as the earth being peeled like an orange and the peel being fire. And the entire film is essentially told from the point of view of one individual, of the lead actor, a man in his late 20s or early 30s who is essentially hedonistic in nature, self-centered. And through his point of view, we discover that he isn't quite as self-centered as we are originally led to believe. It starts off with him leaving his girlfriend on a villa on the beach front as he goes to a party where he doesn't want to feel pain. He doesn't want to experience death. He simply wants to forget everything, block everything out in a drug-induced stupor, so those final moments won't be agonizing as the apocalyptic wave of fire washes over them all. And while he's en route to this party, he meets a girl who has been abducted by two men. And after saving her from her abductors, she explains to him that she is trying to reunite with her father. After a bit of deliberation, he agrees to take her to a party where someone at that party he assumes will be willing to help her take her to her Aunt Janice's, where her father awaits. Things don't go according to plan, however, and the protagonist decides that he doesn't want to stay at the party. It is very hedonistic, but it's also nihilistic. People are drugged out of their minds, but they're also sort of, it's very The Great Gatsby. People are sick, they are dying. You have people playing Russian roulette and shooting themselves. Essentially, people are killing themselves in front of each other and they just don't care. So it isn't exactly what you call going out with a bang in the way that you would want. It's very bleak, a bleak sort of party. And he decides not to stay. And he goes with the girl to her father's, only to discover that they're too late, and her father has committed suicide along with everyone else. Her entire family is gone. And the entire premise of this film is essentially coming to grips with the fact that you are already dead. We're already dead, the lead actor says to his girlfriend in the movie before he leaves her at the beachfront villa. And the entire time, you're presented with a side of society that used to be everyday, sort of normal, and yet there's something wrong. Everyone's gone, or people are being killed, or you have a police officer who is telling you, the audience, that he's going to kill his entire family, and he is begging for forgiveness, and he hasn't showered in days, and he is discount, and he has a pistol, an automatic pistol with 4 bullets in it. One for him and his wife, and one for each of his 2 daughters. And you're constantly presented with this depiction of modern society, and yet all life has been sort of robbed from it. And what we're left with is essentially a graveyard, as people are essentially waiting to die. And I really thought it was effective here, given that most of the time the only 2 people that you meet are the main character, the protagonist, and the young girl, his ward. And there are moments where he has to protect her, and there are also moments where he has to come to grips with his own situation when he realizes that when he's at the party and he's meeting up with an old flame, she says, we have this place, and he is shown this place by her, essentially a vault underneath their house, where they plan to stay, to weather the storm, if you will. Now, when I first saw this scene, I thought to myself, well, if it's a tidal wave or if it's water, then maybe, just maybe, they might be able to survive. I thought maybe the language used by the girl was figurative. The earth being peeled like an orange, and it being essentially a peel of fire, and that after that, everything will have been burned or incinerated. And it made sense in retrospect when he replies, no, this is crazy, this won't work, this vault, you'll be cooked alive. It's a tomb, not a home. And it's a very difficult film in certain ways, but very emotionally effective, given that you only have two characters on screen for the majority of it. Just about everyone else is window dressing, with the exception of one other person in the film. Everyone else is either in the background with no lines or dialogue, and apart from a handful of other characters who have a handful of lines, most of the dialogue is between this protector and his ward. And it's interesting to see how she reacts to this situation in a way that is somewhat innocent, but also somewhat hard-boiled for such a small girl. When she finds her father dead, she asks her guardian to carry him to a lake, and draped in a shawl, she picks flowers and lays them on his deceased body. And she talks about remembering him when he was alive and apologizing to the guardian, whose arm she bit when he said, we have to go, I'll take you to meet my girlfriend, the woman I left at the villa. And she bites him because she doesn't want to leave. But after a certain amount of time, she apologizes and says, I'm sorry I bit you, but I must stay here with my father. And she's, at this point, essentially accepted the fact that she's going to die. And perhaps the way that she views it, she doesn't quite fully understand what it means to die. She's somewhat innocent. And there are certain situations that they find themselves in that I don't expect her to fully comprehend it. When she is kidnapped, she doesn't realize what the men who had kidnapped her earlier in the film had in store for her. And when she's going to stay with her father at the end, as far as she understands it, her father explained exactly what was going to happen. But children have a strange way of viewing these things. They don't always fully understand what it means, the finality of death. The movie did have a bit of narration in regards to the there was someone who was essentially giving the audience an update every hour or so in regards to, we have 12 hours, we have 10 hours, and this is this radio station checking in if there's anyone here. And he's essentially talking to himself, akin to, say, Jack Burton in Big Trouble in Little China. This is Jack Burton in the Pork Chop Express, and I'm talking to who's ever out there. And in this particular film, these final hours, this narrator, who is unidentified, he goes he's nameless. He doesn't provide the audience with a name, but he's just sort of talking. And in the end, he says, I'm sure you can hear that rumbling in the air. It's not long now. I wish I could say something poetic. Perhaps. And he didn't say this in the film, but if I were to say something poetic in the face of implacable demise, inexorable doom. I would quote Bronte, "No coward soul is mine." And the film got me thinking, what I would do in that situation if I had to essentially face my death before my time, with no way to really sort of avoid it. And this film ends in a very sort of stark manner, and it reminded me of the ending in Star Wars or Rogue One, where you had the two characters, the female protagonist of that film, and one of the rebels that she had befriended, the quasi-romantic interest, if you will, and I can't remember any of the characters' names from that film, but towards the end, they are on the beach, and the Death Star has just fired a laser into the planet, which has created an explosion that is expanding, sending a wave of fire towards them as they sit on the beach, and it was practically identical to what happens at the end of this film, these final hours, where the protagonist returns to the beachside villa and he finds his girlfriend, the woman that he actually loves. When he went to the party, he visited an old flame, a woman who was, as the young Waard in the film said, pretty, but not that pretty, and a little weird. And I could see why, in that case, she would be a squeeze, a girl on the side, but not someone that you could really expect to provide a lot of emotional support in a situation where you're facing your inevitable demise. And all she wanted to do was have sex, do coke, and cling to this delusion that you could hide in a concrete bunker and survive this type of apocalypse. So in the end, he returns to the woman that he actually loves. Someone who was prettier, someone who was pregnant. She told him before he left at the start of the film, "I'm pregnant." He didn't respond well to that. Perhaps most guys don't respond well to being told by their girlfriends or significant others that they are expecting. But he didn't take it especially well, and he left. But at the end of the film, he returns and joins her on the beachfront as the wave of fire approaches them. And it wasn't, visually, it was a little bit different, though, than Star Wars Rogue One, where in that film it was essentially a wall of light. It was almost blinding in that film, and you couldn't quite see what was coming. And the characters are swallowed by light, whereas in these final hours, you see the wall of fire, and as it gets closer, the sky gets darker, and it is a cloud of roiling black fume and fire, kind of like the Balrog from Lord of the Rings, except much bigger. And it's not censored in any shape or form, and the man and his woman are holding each other in their arms. He says, "I love you." At the very end, he's able to say that, "I love you." And then she says to him, "I love you." Kind of like the end of Rocky, except even bleaker, because the characters die at the end. And then you see the point of view of, essentially, the fire, the characters' faces as they look on at their approaching demise, and you see sparks and brimstone shooting past them as they stare into the void. And then at the very end, as they're holding each other, she says, "It's beautiful." At which point, it gets brighter and brighter until the screen is essentially enveloped in blinding light. It's a fade to white. And then you have a black screen with appearing and disappearing font with no music. And I thought to myself, okay, this, towards the end of the film, leading up to the final moment, you had music. And as they're holding each other in their arms, and as the fire approaches and they're sort of watching it, there's no way they can escape it, there's music. But at the very end, after the fire is swept over them and we are blinded as an audience, there's no music at all, just credits. And I thought to myself, wow, you know, it's very bleak. It doesn't pull any punches. It doesn't sugarcoat anything. And yet, it was a very emotionally powerful film. It was emotional when the protagonist stops by his mother's and she says, I said goodbye to you many times, but then you actually had to show up and appear. And they have to say goodbye for good. And he says, I'm sorry. And she holds his hand. And she says, don't. And you can kind of tell there's a little bit of history between them, and she's kind of accepted that he's sort of a rough and tumble, difficult son. But at that moment, you can see the distress in her eyes. At first she says, I thought I might be happy or sad, but I'm just numb. But in those final moments, you can see just a hint of hysteria, of sadness. And when the guardian leaves the ward with her deceased father, and she says, I'm going to look as you drive away until I can see you no more. Will you watch me until you can see me no more? And he says, yes. And as he's driving away, you can see the girl running after him, waving, until eventually she's gone. And it's just a really touching film. It's in ways that you might not expect. I think a lot of people, when they think of touching, they think films where people fall in love. But in these final moments, it's poignant. That idea that we're all dead already. And people forget, of course, that we are doomed to die, as Tolkien said, in regards to the 9 mortal men doomed to die in his poem, One Ring to Rule Them All. We are born mortal. And we forget that. And this film sort of focuses on everything being drawn into focus when our mortality is made plain to us. And it's a very effective film. It's a very bleak film, but it's also a very emotionally poignant or resonant film. It kind of reminded me of a film called Come and See, which was a film about World War II told from the point of view of a Russian boy who essentially is recruited into a ragtag sort of defense system by Soviet resistance forces during the Nazi Blitzkrieg. And it's a very violent film, and his simple country life is essentially set upon by these warlike forces that turn his life upside down. And we are constantly exposed to these violent acts that remind us that it's so tenuous or thin, this membrane between modern society where everything seems perfectly safe, and then the illusion is broken and you realize that we're mortal and that we can die and that things can come unwound so easily. And there's a certain poignance in this film, these final hours, where it has a similar level of brutality in certain scenes, but it's not exactly the focus. The focus is on how we respond to being in a situation where we are completely out of control. And oftentimes I can relate to these characters feeling as though not being in control. And I can applaud the film for that. It's certainly not something that I would watch with friends with the expectation of laughing, with the expectation of having a good time. But it is something that generates a genuine emotional response with no budget to speak of. Half the time the sets on screen didn't even feel like sets. It felt real. And that was part of the efficacy of this film, is that everything on screen felt not like a set. It felt like a real place, like 28 Days Later, where you felt as though you were in London 28 days later after some type of epidemic that had swept the city clean of all life. And in this film, These Final Hours, Australia is essentially the same way, where you have this very real setting that has been swept clear of everything. And this guardian is taking this girl from place to place, and every place that they go, people are hostile, dead, or being made dead in various shapes or forms. And even if they're not, there's a certain sort of reserved acceptance to the fact that just because they're not literally dead at that moment, they will be in a handful of hours. And this is something that both characters have to come to accept, the child and the adult. And the way that they have to spend their time in their final moments is often incomplete. Those that they wish to spend time with are either gone, or even if they're not gone, in a certain way, if they're not gone physically, they're already gone emotionally. And it's just a very powerful film. But again, not something I'd watch if I'd say just wanted to have a good laugh, because it's not exactly a funny film. I will say that much about it. But I do recommend it if you're in for a powerful experience. But you have to keep in mind that a powerful experience, theatrically or cinematically, doesn't always translate to fun. This type of film isn't entertaining in the same way that, say, Animal House is. It's not escapism. It's not entertainment purely for the sake of it in a way that sort of shields you from life's hard realities. Rather, it is the embracing of this difficult truth. In the film, of course, this idea that we can't escape our fate, our doom. And sometimes I think people take a certain amount of comfort in ignorance induced by cinematic illusion. And this isn't one of those films. But if you can learn to sort of embrace that power, it has a certain captivating quality to it. Though I consider myself to be rather strange and unusual, being drawn to such powerful forces in regards to one day I will die, or I'm surrounded by a universe that is infinitely large, populated with titanic astral bodies that crash together and create cataclysmic explosions in space or other sort of interstellar phenomena that dwarf me in such a way that doesn't even really register on a scale that I can comprehend. Or I read H.P. Lovecraft, and there are certain things about that in regards to the insignificance of man in the face of greater things. I'm attracted to that, or the idea that reality is something abstract that we can't grasp, and the idea that things that we perceive are real, and that we have to rely on imagination or illusion to sort of point at things that we can't actually perceive. These kinds of uncomforting philosophical concepts that suggest that we are minor or insignificant in the grand scheme of things, I've always been sort of drawn to that, or the idea of death. And that there's a certain beauty in that power, that sublime quality that sort of transcends us as a species on this impossible planet that we inhabit. And I can really appreciate it when a film comes along and makes me say to myself, wow, yeah, that's pretty much how I feel about it. And yeah, so again, a good film, and if you're into that kind of thing, I can't recommend this one enough. And given how little it must have taken to film this, just in regards to its budget, it's driven entirely by the performance of two characters on screen, like Paper Moon, where you had Tatum and Ryan O'Neal, father and daughter. It was kind of like that. I mean, you have other characters in the film, but by and large, it is an odyssey told from the point of view of two characters. I really like movies like that that can pull that off, and it takes a certain amount of actor currency to be able to get you from beginning to end without being bored or without feeling as though, okay, there's something lacking here in regards to the performance or the emotional stamina of the film. But this movie pulls it off. From beginning to end, I was constantly engaged. There were certain moments where I felt exhilarated. The Guardian is in danger, or he is put into a situation where you're not sure if he's going to make it, what's going to happen to the girl. But in the end, you also are reminded constantly that these characters are already dead. In a handful of hours, they will be gone. So it doesn't really matter if they get shot or not. But the movie does kind of make you forget that, you know, just for brief moments where the Guardian has a gun pointed at him and you think to yourself, oh man, please don't shoot him. And then in retrospect, you look at that scene in retrospect and you say to yourself, you know, they're going to be dead soon anyway, so if he gets shot then, or if he dies on the beach being consumed by fire, it doesn't really matter. But the movie makes you care about these characters, and I think that's a testament to its strength. You don't want him to get shot. You want some type of closure. And that's one of the film's greatest strengths, I think. Being in a situation where you're outside of control, where you don't have any power to influence it in a way that doesn't result in the annihilation of your happiness, so to speak, or what you want in that. And you want some type of closure. With my ex-girlfriend, for instance. I didn't want to break up with her, and for the longest time it felt like the end of the world to me. A bit extreme, but extreme emotions are sort of par for the course in regards to my emotional gamut. And I remember thinking to myself, I have no influence or control over this. She's like a force of nature, and I have no way to sort of communicate with her any more than I would the sky or a tornado or the sun. And eventually I just wanted some type of closure, even if it wasn't what I would have preferred ultimately. And that's what I thought about in regards to these characters. I wanted the little girl to find her father, and I wanted the older character, the Guardian, to find some type of closure, even if it wasn't picture perfect. And in his case, he decides that he wants to be with the woman that he actually loves, and he's able to make it to her. He's driving back and his car breaks down, but he's able to run the final leg of the journey and join her on the beach. And she's angry at him, and she's slapping him and pushing herself away from him, and she said, "You left me." Well, of course you would be upset. But in the final moment she says, "I love you." And that's a bit of closure. In his final moments when they're both alive together, they are together and they know that they love each other. And faced with this final sort of moment with my ex, I thought to myself, if I could just tell her one last time, I love you, that would make all the difference. Because the way that it ended initially, I never had the chance. She just cut all ties. And I thought I would spend the rest of my life never being able to have the chance to tell her how I truly felt. And then finally, when the time came, I had the opportunity to say my final words to her. She didn't want to continue things. And I thought, okay, I have, in this moment, an option. And I thought to myself, okay, I can either say, "Fuck you, bitch," or I can say, "I love you." And I wanted to say, "Fuck you, bitch." A part of me did, but it didn't feel genuine. And I wanted to tell her what was really in my heart, how I truly felt. As stupid as it may sound, as poorly as she treated me in the end, I still love her. And I'm hoping that goes away in time. And it already has, to a certain degree. I spent about a year, going on 2 years, feeling as though it would never subside. But when I had the chance to tell her how I truly felt, I feel better. You know, there was a certain amount of closure, and I was able to sort of put a tourniquet on it. But still, I was completely out of control in that situation. I had no power to sort of divert what was doomed to happen. She had no interest in being a part of my life any longer. So, I identified with these characters, you know. Metaphorically speaking, you know, there were certain metaphorical parallels, if you will, with this film that I watched and my own life. I mean, nothing is entirely symmetrical ever when we sit down and watch films, but in my case, I really sort of empathize with these characters faced with this impossible situation that they could not resolve entirely in a completely happy fashion. All they could hope for was some type of closure, and in the end they get it, and you feel satisfied, despite the fact that they're sort of paradoxically put in a situation where you're like, no, don't die. Well, they're already dead. But wait, give them closure, and then when they get closure, you realize, wow, that still kind of sucks. But it beats the alternative. They're able to be with those that they care about in the end. And in my case, it didn't really work out quite like that. But in the end, I was able to get some type of closure that, while not symmetrical, is equivalent in regards to its cathartic quality, if you will. So anyways, guys, if you like this video, like, share, and subscribe. I will be releasing further videos throughout the month leading up to me getting on a plane in September and flying over to Manchester to start my graduate career, essentially as a graduate student, studying Gothic English literature. Up until that moment, though, I will be doing more videos. They probably won't all be this serious. It depends on what film I watch or what news I hear about Ridley Scott and the Alien series, or perhaps something else. I saw a film by Guillermo del Toro that's coming out that looked kind of interesting. I think it was called The Shape of Water. It kind of reminded me of BioShock, visually speaking. But in any case, guys, thanks for watching and stay tuned for more. Until then, watch the skies.